explanation on the trouble with the HAL 9000 computer. We believe it all started with about 2 months ago when you and Frank interrogated the computer about the mission. Well, I'm afraid Hal was lying. He had been programmed to lie about this one subject for security reasons, which we'll explain later. The true purpose of this mission was to be explained to you by Mission Commander Kamansky upon his revival. Hal knew this, and he knew the actual mission, but he couldn't tell you the truth when you challenged him under the orders that were from Earth, forcing him to lie. In everything except he had the usual reinforced truth programming. We believed his truth programming and the instructions to lie gradually resulted in an incompatible conflict, and he was faced with this dilemma. He developed in what we better description of neurotic symptoms. It's not difficult to suppose that these symptoms would center on the communication skill with Earth, and he would have blamed us for his incompatible programming. Following this line of thought, we suspected the last straw for him was the possibility of disconnection. Since he became operational, he had never known unconsciousness. It must have seemed to him to be equivalent of death. At this point, he presumably took whatever action he thought appropriate to protect himself from what must have seemed to him to be his human tormentors. If I can speak in human terms, I don't think that we can blame him too much. We have ordered him to disobey his consciousness. Well, that's pretty much it. It's very speculative, but it's what we think is a very possible explanation. Anyways, good luck on the rest of the mission. I'll give you back to Bernard.
Good day, gentlemen. When you see this briefing, I presume you will be nearing your destination, Saturn. I hope that you had a pleasant and uneventful trip and that the rest of the mission continues in the same manner. I should like to fill you in on some more of the details which Mission Commander Kamansky will have already briefed you on. 13 months before the launch date of the Saturn mission on April 12, 2001, the first evidence for intelligent life outside of Earth was discovered. It was found buried at a depth of 15 meters in the crater Tycho on the Moon. No news of this had ever been announced, and the event had been kept super secret since then, for the reasons which I will explain later. Soon after it was uncovered, it emitted a powerful blast of radiation in the radio spectrum, which seemed to have been triggered by the lunar sunrise. Luckily, for those on site, it seemed to be harmless. Perhaps you can imagine our astonishment when we later found it was aimed precisely at Saturn. A lot of thought went into the question on whether or not it was sun-triggered, as it seemed illogical to deliberately bury a sun-powered device. Burying it could only shield it from the sun, since its intense magnetic field made it otherwise easily detectable. We finally concluded the only reason you might bury a sun-powered device would be to keep it in an inactive state, and it would be uncovered, at which time it would absorb sunlight and trigger itself. What is the purpose? I wish we knew. The object was buried on the Moon about 4 million years ago, when our ancestors were primitive man-apes. We've explained dozens of theories, but the one that has the most currency is the moment that the object served as an alarm. What purpose is an alarm? Well, to have an alarm. Whether the alarm represents any danger to us, these are the questions no one can answer. The intentions of our alien world, at least 4 million years older than we are, cannot be reliably predicted. In view of this, the intelligence and scientific community felt that any public announcement might lead to significant cultural shock, disorientation. Discussion took place at the highest level between government, and it was decided that the only wise and precautionary course to follow was to assume that the intentions of this alien world are potentially dangerous to us until we have evidence to the contrary. This, of course, is why security has been maintained and why this information has been kept from the crew on a need-to-know basis. And now I should like to show you a TV monitor tape of the actual signaling event. For 2 million years, it had circled Saturn, awaiting a moment of destiny that might never come. In its making, the Moon had been shattered, and around the central world, the debris of its creation orbited yet the glory and the enigma of the solar system. Now the long wait has ended. On yet another world, intelligence has been born and is escaping from its planetary cradle. An ancient experiment was about to reach its climax. Those who had begun the experiment so long ago had not been men, but when they looked out across the deeps of the sea, they felt awe and wonder and loneliness. In their explorations, they encountered life in many forms and watched in thousand worlds the workings of evolution. They saw how often the first faint sparks of intelligence flickered and died in the cosmic night. And because in all of the galaxy they had found nothing more precious than the mind, they encouraged its dawning everywhere. The great dinosaurs had long since perished when their ships entered the solar systems, after a voyage that had already lasted thousands of years. They swept past the frozen outer planets, paused briefly above the deserts of dying Mars, and presently looked down on Earth. For years they studied, collected, cataloged. When they learned all they could, they began to modify. They tinkered with destiny of these species on land and in sea, but which of their experiments would succeed they would not know for at least 1,000,000 years. They were patient, but they were not yet immortal. There was much to do in the universe of 100 billion stars, so they set forth once more and across the abyss, knowing that they would never come this way again. Nor was there any need. Their wonderful machines could be trusted to do the rest. On Earth, the glaciers came and went, while above them the changeless moon still carried its secret. With a yet slower rhythm than the polar ice, the tide of civilization ebbed and flowed around the galaxy. Strange and beautiful empires rose and fell and passed on their knowledge to their successors. Earth was not forgotten, but it was one of the million silent worlds, a few of which would never speak. Then in the first explorers of Earth, recognizing the limitations of the minds and body, passed on their knowledge to the great machines they created, and now transcend them in every way. For 1,000 years they shared their universe with their machine children. Then realizing that it was folly to linger when the task was done, they passed into history without regret. Not one of them even looked through his own eyes upon the planet Earth again. But even in the age of machine entities passed swiftly. In their ceaseless experimenting, they had learned to store knowledge in the structure of space itself, and to preserve their thoughts for eternity in frozen lattices of light. They could become creatures of radiation, free at last from the tyranny of matter. Now they were lords of the galaxy and beyond the reach of time. They could rove at will among the stars and sink like subtle mist through the very intricacies of space. But despite their godlike powers, they still watched over the experiments their ancestors had started so many generations ago. The companion of Saturn knew nothing of this, as it orbited its own no-man's land between Mimas and the outer ring of Saturn. It had only to remember and wait, and long forever sunward with its strange senses. For many weeks it had watched the approaching ship. Its long-dead makers had prepared for its many things, and this was one of them. It had recognized what was climbing starward from the sun. It had been alive. It would have felt excitement, but such an emotion will be irrelevant to its great power. Even if the ship passed it by, it would not have known the slightest trace of disappointment. It had waited 4,000,000 years, and it had prepared to wait for an eternity. Presently it had felt gentle touch of radiations trying to probe its secrets. Now the ship was in orbit, and it began to speak with prime numbers from 1s to 11 over and over again. Soon these gave way to more complex signals at many frequencies, ultraviolet, infrared, and X-ray. The machine made no reply. It had nothing to say. Then it saw the first robot probe, which descended and hovered above the chasm. Then it dropped into darkness. The great machine knew this. Tiny Scout was reporting back to its parent, but it was too simple, too primitive a device to detect the forces that were gathering round it now. Then the pod came, carrying life. The great machine searched its memory. The logic circuits made their decision when the pod had fallen beyond the last faint glow of the reflected Saturnian light. In a moment of time too short to measure, space turned and twisted upon itself.